All right, everyone. So I want to talk to you guys about all these Orthodox people who are upset with me, and this is really a response to these people. So I did a video recently talking about the schism between the Moscow Patriarchate and the Constantinople Patriarchate, and I also talked about how NATO facilitated the creation of a Ukrainian nationalist church under the Kiev Patriarchate as a proxy against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under the Moscow Patriarchate, because NATO wants to remove any sort of Russian influence in Ukraine. So there is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, and it is under the Moscow Patriarchate. Therefore, it is a threat to NATO's influence, because religion, as we all know, is always extremely influential in society. And so if NATO is going to influence Ukrainian society, it's going to have to remove the influence of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church because it is under the Moscow Patriarchate. This is what I said in my video. And so I talked about how there was the schism of 2018 between the Moscow Patriarchate and the Constantinople Patriarchate. And I talked about how what really sparked this divide between the two patriarchates was Patriarch Bartholomew recognizing two Ukrainian nationalist schismatic sects as legitimate churches. And Bartholomew declared that it was permissible for these churches to be a part of the new Ukrainian church under the Kiev Patriarchate. Well, what got people really upset was me saying that there was a schism that broke out in 2018 between Moscow and Constantinople. And these Orthodox people are telling me there was no schism, there is no schism, there was simply a break in the communion between Moscow and Constantinople. No. There was a schism. Absolutely there was a schism. Look at the statement that was made by the Moscow Patriarchate. Look at what it says here. This is what the Moscow Patriarchate declared in 2018. Look at what it says here. To admit into communion schismatics and a person anathematized another local church with all the bishops and clergy consecrated by him. Now, in this case, they're talking about the nationalistic / Nazi sects in Ukraine that were declared legitimate by Patriarch Bartholomew, the encroachment on somebody else's canonical regions, the attempt to abandon its own historical decisions and commitments, because decades ago, we're talking like back in the 1990s, the Constantinople Patriarchate agreed that those Ukrainian nationalist sects were indeed schismatic and did not recognize them as legitimate. And so in 2018, Patriarch Bartholomew basically turned against what he himself declared decades ago by saying that these nationalist sects are legitimate and not schismatic. So the Russians said, wait a second, you rescinded your own declaration, and you have made these Ukrainian Nazi sects, these far-right sects that revere Stepan Bandera, who was a Ukrainian collaborator with the Nazis and who orchestrated atrocities on the Polish people. You have declared these sects as legitimate. And if you're going to do this, we are not going to be a part of you. We're not going to be with you in communion. This is what the Russians told the Constantinople Patriarchate. And so the Patriarchate goes on to say, the Moscow Patriarchate's statement of 2018 goes on to say, all this leads the Patriarchate of Constantinople beyond the canonical space and, to our great grief, makes it impossible for us to continue the Eucharistic community with its hierarch, clergy, and laity. From now on, until the Patriarchate of Constantinople's rejection of its anti-canonical decisions, it is impossible for all the clergy of the Russian Orthodox Church to concelebrate with the clergy of the Church of Constantinople, and for the laity to participate in sacraments administered in its churches. In other words, Russian Orthodox Christians cannot participate in the communion, in the Eucharistic celebration, in the churches that are under the Constantinople Patriarchate. That is a schism right there. That is schism. Now, why are so many Greek Orthodox people upset when someone just points out that there indeed was a schism between the Constantinople Patriarchate and the Moscow Patriarchate? Why is this? Why? I put some thought into this, and here's what I think. If you look at the Christian world, the country that has the most energy and the most zeal for Christianity is Russia. You're going to say, oh my God, that's so laughable, Theodore. No, it's not. I remember back in 2013, 2014, 2015, NATO was sending its LGBT activists into Russia to try to promote Sodom in that country. And the Russian Orthodox Christians would fight against those activists, and they made it so difficult for the Sodom activists that the Sodom activists pretty much have given up on Russia. Do you see LGBT activism in Russia? You know, I mean, if there is, it's very, very small. It's very marginal. You don't see it as much anymore. I haven't heard about it in many years. I haven't heard about serious LGBT activism in Russia, since, I don't know, around 10 years or so ago. You just don't really hear about it anymore. Why is that? Because the Russians fought against that agenda with such zeal and ferocity that they instilled so much consternation in the ambassadors of Sodom that Sodom pretty much just gave up. That's how much zeal there is in Russia. There is in Russia this energy. You have this energy in Russia. There is a concept of energy in Christianity. You can read about this, for example, in Palamas's The Triads, which is a beautiful, beautiful text of Christianity. I read through most of that book many years ago, and it is one of the most beautiful pieces of Christian literature that I've ever read. And I was actually surprised to find out that the Catholic Church declared that book heretical for centuries. I just didn't really understand why. It's such a beautiful text, and it's all about really becoming an instrument of God, really participating in God, in God's work, and entering into a state of theosis, becoming one with God, the divine union with God. And it's such a beautiful work. And the book is all about loving God with all of your heart and having zeal. And it really, really goes back to the Christian teaching that is found in both the Old and New Testaments. Love the Lord your God with all of your might, with all of your strength, with all of your body, with all of your heart, with all of your mind, with all of your soul. That's really what Palamas was trying to instill into people. And the fact that the Orthodox Christians in Russia fought against Sodom with such zeal and ferocity really reflected this Christian zeal and energy. For example, there was a band in Russia that called themselves Pussy Riot. And I think they were some sort of a NATO psyop to try to undermine Russian Christianity. But this band were all about mocking Christianity and undermining the Christian roots of Russian society. And they committed an utter act of blasphemy and sacrilege back in, I want to say, 2013. Pussy Riot goes into one of the holiest churches in Russia. It's a church dedicated to the Virgin Mary. And they went into this church while people were praying, and they were mocking Christianity and mocking God and mocking the Virgin Mary. And what happened? These band members were arrested, and they were sentenced to prison. I think they were given a 3-year prison sentence. Freaking Ted Cruz decides to defend this ban and say, oh, you see, the Russians, they're putting these women in prison because they were simply expressing their opinions. And this is not the world that we want. This is why America needs to have its influence all over the world, because if we don't have our influence, we're going to have Putin despotism all over the world. They're going to put people in prison for mocking Christianity. He was defending the people who were mocking Christianity. And this is supposed to be an evangelical Christian. Now for Israel, he's very zealous, very religious, but for a church dedicated to the Holy Theotokos, he doesn't care. But Russia put those people in prison. Russia arrested them. Why? Because they were mocking the Virgin Mary. So there is a zeal in Russia that is growing. Now, I understand there's still a lot of atheists in Russia, and this is really a residue, and this is a part of the legacy of Bolshevism and the Soviet Union. But there really is a Christian revival that is happening in that country. And when people talk about a country that a Christian can be proud of, what do they talk about, right? They don't talk about America. They definitely don't talk about America, because America is the biggest promoter of Sodom. They're not talking about England, because Christianity is dead in England. Atheism and Darwinism is the religion of England. Hell, they even have a Darwin Day in England. People aren't talking about Italy. The Catholics, they have Italy. They have the Vatican. But what is the Vatican? I mean, it's a bunch of homosexual priests and monks, and they'll talk about the importance of the Eucharist in the public, but a lot of times they're sympathizing with Sodom, and the Vatican has been covering up for the crimes against children committed by clergy members for decades. So there's nothing really to be proud of when looking at the Vatican. They've been covering up for horrendous crimes for decades, crimes done by their clergy members. So when you look at the Catholic world, it's like, what do you got, right? You have Poland. Out of all the Catholic world, the country that they talk about the most is Poland. No one's talking about Mexico. No one's talking about Peru. Argentina, who gives a shit about Argentina? What are they known for? They're known to make some of the most atrocious exploitative movies on earth. Who gives a shit about freaking Argentina? Who gives a damn about Mexico? Mexico is a country of Sodom. It's one of the most pro-Sodom countries on the face of the earth. Cartels, they got cartels butchering people alive, cannibalizing people, kidnapping people for their organs. I mean, really horrific stuff. Massive sex trafficking. So who gives a shit about Mexico when it comes to Christianity? What else do we got? The Philippines. What? The Philippines is one of the most pro-Sodom countries on earth. When I hear about the Philippines, I'm like, gay until proven otherwise. I don't really care about the Philippines, even though it's the most populous Catholic country in the world. But when it comes to Catholicism, the country that Catholics are proud of the most is Poland. Why? Because the Poles will fight against the agents of Sodom. Now, why do the Poles fight against the agents of Sodom? Well, it's because they're Christians, but also I think it's because the Poles genetically are the same people as the Russians, and so they have that same sort of they got that same sort of vibe to them. The Poles and the Russians, I think, are a lot more similar than they would like to think. I know they have a long history of war and animosity towards each other, but a lot of Polish people, they remind me of Russian people. And even the Polish language, from what I understand, is very similar to Russian. But the Poles, they got a similar Russian vibe to them. And so the agents of Sodom, they went to Poland, and the Poles were like, get the hell out of here. Bam. And you don't really hear so much about LGBT activism in Poland. Why? Because the Poles are like the Russians, and they fought against that evil. Why are Catholics so proud of Poland? Because Poland actually has energy. Poland actually has zeal. Poland has that spirit energy. So Russia has that spirit energy that Palamas talks about, that energy of zeal and loving God with all of your heart and your body and your mind and your soul. And so imagine, right? You're so proud of Russia. You're like, I love the Russians. I love what they're doing, man. Imagine you're a Greek Orthodox Christian and you love Russia. You're so proud of Russia. You're so proud to have Russia as a member of the Orthodox world. And then all of a sudden, it's 2018, and you hear that the Russian Orthodox Church is so pissed off at the Patriarch of Constantinople, who's sort of like the Pope of the Greeks, because the Greeks, I mean, the original capital, the original capital of the Hellenic world was Constantinople. I mean, it's kind of like what the Petrarch Lavra is for the Russians in Ukraine. I mean, Petrarch Lavra is one of the most, if not the most important church for the Russian Orthodox world. And so you have the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. That was the Vatican for the Greeks, and that was the head of the Hellenic world at one point in time. And now it's no longer in that position because it's been controlled by the Turks for centuries. It's been controlled by the Turks since 1453. And NATO comes along and says, okay, we don't like the Russian Orthodox Church because the Russian Orthodox Church is under the Moscow Patriarchate. We hate Russia. We hate Moscow. We hate the Russian Orthodox Church. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church is under the Moscow Patriarchate. So we want to create a new church. So what happens? Bartholomew comes along and says, okay, the Ukrainians can have their own church under the Kiev Patriarchate. And in fact, there are two Ukrainian Nazi sects, and yes, they are Nazi sects because they love Bandera and they love the OUN, the Organization for Ukrainian Nationalists, which collaborated with the Nazis and which took part in the genocide and slaughter of the Polish people in the 1940s. Bartholomew recognizes these two Banderite sects as legitimate, and the Russians said, what? We're done with you, Bartholomew. So imagine you're this Greek Orthodox Christian, right? And you're so proud of the fact that Russia is in your team religiously. And then you hear that Russia just rejected the patriarch of the Constantinople Patriarchate. And you're a Greek Orthodox person. You love Bartholomew. You think he's great, just like Catholics love the Pope. And you're thinking, wait, what? Russia, the coolest country in the Orthodox world, the country that has all the zeal and all the aesthetics, and the country that has all that Christian spirit energy, is against my patriarch? Man, say it ain't so. That sucks. And then someone comes along and says, yeah, there's a schism. There's a schism. And in fact, the Moscow Patriarchate made a statement declaring it is impossible, and these are the words of the Moscow Patriarchate, it is impossible for all the clergy of the Russian Orthodox Church to concelebrate with the clergy of the Church of Constantinople, and for the laity to participate in sacraments administered in its churches. In other words, your churches, the churches under Bartholomew, are not legitimate. And we want nothing to do with your Eucharistic celebration until Bartholomew corrects the wrongdoing that he has done at the behest of NATO. We're not going to partake in your Eucharistic celebrations. Man, as a Greek Orthodox Christian, as someone who, this is not me, but I'm just saying this as an example, for someone who is very, very dedicated to Bartholomew, to hear that Russia rejected you, ouch. Ouch, right? The coolest Orthodox church in all the world of Orthodoxy doesn't like your patriarch and has gone so far as to say that Eucharistic rites under the Constantinople Patriarchate are not even legitimate. That would suck. That would be like being a Catholic from the Philippines and being told by a Polish Catholic or being told by a bunch of Polish Catholics, Filipino Catholic Church, kind of weird. Ouch, man. Poland wants nothing to do with us? Man, that sucks, right? The coolest Catholic country in all the Catholic world wants nothing to do with us? Ouch, that sucks. And so imagine being an Orthodox Christian and hearing that. You would be in denial, right? You would be in denial. And a lot of people are in denial. I just don't understand this. I remember hearing about the Russian Constantinople, the Moscow Constantinople schism back in 2018 when it was happening. And I remember writing on this subject. And so I thought it was just given information. I thought it was a given that there was a schism. And I did this video and I uploaded the video and I'm like, hey, I want to warn Orthodox Christians that there is indeed a mission by NATO to control your churches. And the comments that I have received have been overwhelmingly negative. The comments that I've been getting are overwhelmingly very angry. And this was something, honestly, this was something that I just did not expect. But I kind of, I thought about it for a while, and I kind of understand. I think I have a grasp as to why people are so upset, or as to why people are so much in denial that there even is a schism. But if a patriarchate says, hey, your Eucharistic celebrations are not legitimate, and in fact, we have obligated our people, Russian Orthodox Christians, to not attend your churches. We have forbidden Russian Orthodox Christians from attending your churches. Now, that's a schism. People want to do wordplay and they want to say, no, it's a break in the communion. That's a schism. That's schism. I don't give a shit what you say. That's a schism. This is like the SSPX versus the Vatican, right? In the Catholic world, there's something called the SSPX. And the SSPX was founded by a guy. His last name was, he's dead, but his last name was Lefebvre. Forgot his first name. Martel Lefebvre. I forgot his first name, but he was a French dude. And he really hated Vatican II, right? And I can't blame him. I mean, Vatican II was pretty weird and cringe and heretical. And he said, Lefebvre said, listen, we want nothing to do with Vatican II. And so what happened? Lefebvre rejected Vatican II. And the Vatican declared Lefebvre to be a schismatic. And Lefebvre started his own movement. And it's called the SSPX, right? The Society of Pius X. St. Pius X. And it's still around today. I actually attended SSPX masses for almost, I want to say for about 4 or 5 years. And the reason why I went to the SSPX is because I was so tired of all the homosexual priests. There's so many priests in the Vatican world who are homosexual. It's unbelievable. I'm shocked that people are still in denial about this reality. But the SSPX is considered schismatic, and the Vatican makes it very clear that Catholics are forbidden from participating in the masses of the SSPX churches. Why? Why is that? Because the SSPX is deemed as a schismatic movement. Therefore, there is a schism within the Catholic world between the SSPXers and the Vaticaners, the Vaticanites. That's schism. I mean, if I go to an Orthodox church, right, and I become a member of the Orthodox Church, and I say, hey, I would like to go to a Roman Latin rite. I would like to go to a mass, and I would like to participate in the Eucharistic celebration of the Roman Catholics. Any Orthodox priest would tell me that's not good, because the Roman Catholics are in schism. And they have all sorts of theological problems that have not been settled yet. And you are forbidden as an Orthodox Christian from participating in the Eucharistic rite of the Roman Catholics. Why is that? Because there's a schism between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox churches. So if I join the Russian Orthodox Church right now, and I say, I'm going to go to a church that is under Patriarch Bartholomew, that is under the Constantinople Patriarchate, a Russian Orthodox Church would tell me, no, you are forbidden. You are forbidden. In accordance to the Moscow Patriarchate's ruling that was made in 2018, you are forbidden. What do you call that? That's called a schism. Doesn't matter how much in denial you want to be. Doesn't matter how much you want to say that, no, it's just a break in communion. There was a break in communion between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. There was a schism. Now, whether or not you want to blame that on the Roman Catholics, or if you want to blame that on the Eastern Orthodox, doesn't matter. There's a schism. There's a schism between the Moscow Patriarchate and the Constantinople Patriarchate. And I wish people could just accept it. Like, yeah, there's a schism. Yeah. Yeah. And I wish people could understand and acknowledge that there is indeed a real problem with what Bartholomew did. I mean, he said that 2 Ukrainian nationalist sects, which are filled with Banderites, are legitimate sects. And the Russian Orthodox Church heard that and they said, whoa, 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 wait a second. Patriarch Bartholomew, you agreed decades ago that these two groups are not legitimate. So now all of a sudden you're changing your mind and you're going against your decree, the decree that you made decades ago? What happened? And so the Russians said, no, we're not going to be in the same boat with you if you're going to be doing this. Understandably so. There was a big problem with that. Now, why would Bartholomew rescind his own decree? Well, it's very obvious. NATO. Bottom line, NATO. Bartholomew is under the superintendence of the Turkish government. The Turkish government is the second largest member of NATO. It's very powerful in the world of NATO. And I've said this a billion times, I'm going to keep saying this. The reason why it has so much political leverage in the world of NATO is because it controls the access way from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. So it's got a lot of geostrategic hold in the NATO world. And the Americans really have been in a Cold War with the Russians for many, many decades, really since the end of the Second World War. And you have the Russian Orthodox Church, which superintends the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And the Americans want to pull Ukraine away from Russia's sphere of influence. Religion, as we all know, is extremely influential in society. So if you're NATO and you want to influence a country, you're going to have to take over the ecclesiastical outlet in that society. Well, in the in Ukraine, the major church there is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and it is under the Moscow Patriarchate. So what does Bartholomew do? He goes against his own decrees and declares two Ukrainian nationalistic sects as legitimate sects. Sects that were declared schismatic decades ago, back in the 90s or 80s. He goes against his own word and says, yeah, the Ukrainians can have their own church. Why would he be interested in that? There's obviously a NATO interest in all of this. And that interest is to form an ecclesiastical proxy against the Russian Orthodox Church, to remove Russia's spiritual influence in Ukraine. Bottom line. This has been the case with Bartholomew since forever. In fact, there is a document that you can read going all the way back to, I want to say the Cold War, and it's from a Greek patriarchate telling the CIA, I am with you, I have many people who are with me, and they will do whatever you like. And that document really does prove and signify that the CIA has been really working with much effort to control the Orthodox world. Because if you can control the Orthodox world, then you can combat the Russian Orthodox world. Because Russia is the enemy of the United States. Plain and simple, it really is that clear. You can go all the way back to Gladio. Gladio was all about what? Supporting Nazis and far-right activists and paramilitaries to form a stay-behind army in Europe to fight against the Soviets in the situation, in the possible scenario of a Soviet invasion of Europe. This is what Gladio was about. And so this has been in the agenda of the CIA, of NATO, for decades. It really is quite obvious. There was an article that was published years ago. I think it was published by a newspaper called The Diplomat or something like that. But anyway, in this article, it talked about how really the Turkish government pressured Bartholomew to allow for the creation of a Ukrainian church. And the reason why the Turks did this was because the Americans told the Turks to do this. And the Americans said that if you do this, we will lift the sanctions being imposed on Turkey over the arrest and the imprisonment of Mr. Pastor Brunson. And so the Turks pressured Bartholomew to create this church at the behest of NATO, because Turkey is a massive member of NATO. And it happened. Bottom line, it happened. Now, someone said, the Moscow or the Constantinople Patriarchate is not under the Turkish government, it's under the CIA. Okay, fine. But What's Turkey under? Turkey is under NATO. Turkey is within the NATO umbrella. And which intelligence agency dominates NATO? It's the CIA. So Turkey and the CIA work in tandem. They work together. Turkish intelligence, CIA, American intelligence, MI5, they all work together. And if you need any proof of this, just go read about Gladio in the context of Turkey. Really interesting stuff. But anyway, I've talked long enough, guys. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.